Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wylie. I'm Nicklas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. Book 12, Protestantism in Germany, from the Augsburg Confession to the Peace of Passau. Chapter 1, the Schmalkald League. The Augsburg Confession, the Emperor's hopes and disappointments, Melanchthon's despair, Luther's courage, formation of the Schmalkald League, the kings of France, England, etc. invited to enter, the Swiss rejected, Luther's hesitation, the Turk invades Europe, Charles offers peace to the Protestants, Peace of Ratisbon, the Church has rest 15 years. We have already traced the history of Protestantism in Germany from the day of the Thesis, 1517, to the day of the Augsburg Confession, 1530. The interval between these two dates is short, but what a train of important and brilliant events marks its currency, and how different the Christendom of the one era to the Christendom of the other. If the hammer of Luther, nailing his propositions to the door of the Schlosskirche, sounded the knell of the old times, the Augsburg Confession, presented only 13 years afterwards, opens us up to the gates of the New World. Where in all history are we to look for a transition so vast, accomplished in so short a time? Of all the factors in human affairs, that which despots commonly account the weakest, and of which they sometimes take no account at all, is immeasurably the strongest: conscience. It is more powerful than philosophy, more powerful than letters, more powerful than the sword. The schoolmen had toiled for ages to enlighten the world, but it was seen at last that their intellectual subtlety could not break the chains of the human soul. Their day faded into the night of mysticism. Next came the revival of letters, the sure prelude, it was said, of a new age. But civilization and liberty did not come at the call of the humanists, and after flourishing a little while, letters began to retrace their steps toward the pagan tomb from which they had come. Skepticism was descending upon the world, but when the Word of God touched the conscience, the world felt itself shaken by a power mightier than that of schools or armies. It tottered upon its foundations. The veil was rent from the heart of Christendom. We resume our narrative at the point where we broke it off, the old town of Augsburg in the year 1530. What a numerous, brilliant, and motley gathering is that which its walls now enclose. Here are all the sovereign princes, dukes, and counts of the empire, with their courts and their men-at-arms. Here are all the great scholars and theologians of Germany, her popish dignitaries, and her Protestant reformers. Here, too, in the train of the chief personages, is much that is neither priestly nor scholarly, lackeys and men-at-arms, idlers and sightseers of a different kind from those which exercise the powers of the combatants in the Palatinate Chapel. A great place is empty in this of the combatant in the Palatinate Chapel. A great place is empty in this vast gathering, that of Luther, but he is no farther off than the castle of Coburg, where, sitting apart and maintaining a key correspondence with his friends, he can make his spirit felt in the Diet and, unseen, guide the course of its debates. All being gathered into Augsburg in obedience to the summons of the emperor. At last, with great pomp, comes the emperor himself, Charles, master of two worlds. Behind him, what a long and brilliant train! Kings, papal legates, ambassadors, archbishops, priests, friars, and some 10,000 men-at-arms. It is medievalism rising up in a power and glory unknown to it for ages, feeling instinctively that its last struggle has come with a power before which it is destined to fall. Before crossing the Alps, Charles V had had an interview with the Pope at Bologna, and these two potentates had come to an understanding touching the policy to be pursued toward the Lutherans. They must be required to submit to the Church. This was the summary and simple solution that awaited the problem of the age. There was, it is true, the promise of a council in the future, and of whatever reforms that council might be pleased to grant. But, first, the Lutherans must return to their obedience. So then the end of the heresy was near. The Pope and the Emperor, the two masters of Christendom, had decreed its extirpation. The brilliant assemblage now gathered from east to west of Germany had come to witness the burial of the Lutheran revolt and the resurrection in new glory and power of Roman Catholicism. But how mortifying to the masters of so many kingdoms! He who had been twice victorious over his great rival Francis I, who had dictated peace at almost the gates of Paris, who had bowed the Pope to his policy, was withstood, thwarted, beaten by these heretical princes and excommunicated preachers. He was compelled to hear them read their confession in open diet, and thus he had erected a stage and got together an audience for the greater eclat of that Lutheranism which he expected to see sink into eternal annihilation beneath the weight of his arms and the prestige of his authority. A whole winter's scheming with the Pope had suddenly collapsed. But Charles could do something toward veiling the humiliation he could not but feel. He bade his theologians prepare an answer to the confession of the Protestant princes and divines. Another unfortunate step. The blundering and sophistry of Dr. Eck acted as a foil to the document which combined the strength of Luther and the eloquence of Melanchthon. The Augsburg Confession stood higher than ever. The emperor bade the Protestants consider themselves refuted. It would seem that he himself had but small faith in this refutation, for he made haste to throw his sword in along with the pen of Dr. Eck against the Protestants. On the 19th of November, 1530, he issued a decree, addressing to the Protestant princes, states, and cities, commanding them, under peril of his displeasure, to return their obedience to the See of Rome, and giving them till the next spring, 15th of April, to make their choice between submission and war. Dr. Eck was rewarded for his services at the council by the bishopric of Vienna, which gave occasion to the witty saying of Erasmus that the poor Luther had made many rich. The edict of the emperor forbade from that hour all further conversations to Protestantism, under pain of forfeiture of goods and life. It further enacted that all which had been taken from the Roman Catholics should be restored, that the monasteries and religious houses should be rebuilt, that the old ceremonies and rites should be observed, and that no one who did not submit to this decree should sit in the imperial chamber, the supreme court of judicature in the empire, and that all classes should assist with their lives and fortunes in carrying out this edict. The Edict of Spires was directed mainly against Luther. The ban of Augsburg was wider in its scope. It fell on all who held his opinions in Germany, on princes, cities, and peasants. Melanchthon was overwhelmed with dismay. He was drowned, says Sladen, with sighs and tears. Happily, Luther yet lived. His magnanimity and faith rose to the occasion. He looked the great emperor and his persecuting edict in the face, and in a characteristic publication foretold that the edict would be a failure, and that even the emperor's sword, strong as it was not strong enough to extinguish the light and bring back the darkness. The spirit of Luther fired the princes. At Christmas, 1530, they met at Schmalkald to deliberate on the steps to be taken. That the religion and liberties must be defended at all costs was with them an axiom. The only question then was, how? They formed the League, known in history as the League of Schmalkald, engaged to stand by one another in the defense of their faith and liberties, and in particular to resist any attempt that might be made by arms to carry out the Edict of Augsburg. For this purpose, they were to maintain, each of them, for the space of 6 years, a military force ready to assist any principality or town which might be attacked by the imperial arms. It was not the question of the religious liberties only that made it seem expedient for the Protestant princes to form this confederacy. To this were added political considerations of no small weight. Recent successes had greatly increased the power and widened, in the same proportion, the ambition of Charles V. The emperor was at this moment revolving schemes dangerous to the constitution and civil liberties of Germany. He had made his brother Ferdinand of Austria be elected king of the Romans. To elect a king of the Romans was to designate the future emperor of Germany. This was a violation of the Golden Bull of Charles IV, inasmuch as it was a manifest attempt on the part of Charles to vest the imperial crown in his family, and to render that dignity hereditary, which the Golden Bull declared to be elective. The Protestant princes saw revolution in all this. The emperor was making himself master. They must resist this usurpation in time. Hence the Schmalkald League, made first at Christmas 1530, and renewed a year after at Christmas 1531, with the addition of a great many princes and cities. They wrote to the King of France, England, Denmark, and to the maritime towns in the north of Germany to enter the League, or otherwise assist in their enterprise. The answer returned were in every case favorable, though considerations of polity made the writers postpone joining the League for the present. This bold step failed at first to meet Luther's approval. It looked like war, and he shuddered at anything that threatened to bring war and the gospel into contact. But when it was explained to him that the League was purely defensive, that it was meant to attack no one, that it was simply an arrangement for enabling its members to exercise unitedly and therefore more successfully their natural rights of self-defense on behalf of what was dearer to them and to their countrymen than life itself, he acquiesced in the League of the Princes. The measure undoubtedly was right in itself, and was demanded by the circumstances of extreme peril in which Protestantism was now apparently placed. It linked the Protestant states of Germany into one confederation, under the aegis of which the Protestant faith might be preached and its doctrines professed, without terror of the stake. Further, we recognize in the Schmalkald League a decided step in the progress of Protestantism. Protestantism as a principle or doctrine was developed in the teaching of the Reformers, but Protestantism was never meant to remain a mere principle. Its mission was to create around it a new political, social, and intellectual world. At the center of that world, the Protestant principle took its place, sitting there as on a throne, or rather dwelling in it as its soul, and in times of peril calling to its defense all those forces, arts, letters, free constitutions, which itself had created. The beginning of this new political world was at Schmalkald. A great many princes and free cities, in addition to the original confederates, had subscribed the League, and now its attitude was a somewhat imposing one. The Swiss Protestant cantons held out their hand, but were repulsed. They were held to be disqualified by their sentiments on the Lord's Supper. This was a grave error. It was nearly as great an error on the other side when the kings of France and England, who could hardly be more orthodox in the eyes of the Germans than were the Zwinglians, were invited to join the League. Happily, these monarchs sent replies which saved the Leaguers from the political entanglements in which an alliance with these scheming and selfish potentates would have been sure to land them. This was the very danger that Luther had feared. He foresaw the League growing strong and beginning to lean on armies, neglecting the development of the religious principle in whose vitality alone would consist the consolidation, power, and success of their federation. If the rampart should smother the heavenly fire it was meant to enclose, both would perish together. When the spring of 1531 came, the emperor, instead of beginning hostilities, paused. The sword that was to have swept German Protestantism from the face of the earth, and which was already half drawn, was thrust back into its sheath. Besides the Schmalkald League, other things had arisen to convince the emperor of the extreme hazard of attempting, at this moment, to enforce the Edict of Augsburg. France, whose monarch was still smarting from the memories of Pavia and the imprisonment at Madrid, threatened to break the peace and commence hostilities against him. The irrepressible Turk was again appearing in the east of Europe. Further, the emperor had given umbrage to the popish princes of Germany by making his brother Ferdinand be elected king of the Romans, and so could not count on the aid of his own party. Thus, ever as Charles put his hand upon his sword's hilt, a new difficulty started up to prevent him drawing it. It must have seemed, even to himself, as if a greater power than the Schmalkald Confederacy were lighting against him. The issue was that Charles, on a survey of his position, found that he must postpone the enforcing of the Edict of Augsburg to a more convenient time, and meanwhile he must come to an understanding with the Protestants. Accordingly, after tedious but difficult negotiations, a peace was agreed upon at Nuremberg, July 23rd, and ratified in the Diet at Ratisbon, August 3rd, 1532. In this pacification, the emperor granted to the Lutherans the free and undisturbed exercise of their religion, until such time as a general council or an imperial diet should decide the religious question, and the Protestants, now 7 princes and 24 cities, promised to aid the emperor in his war against the Turk. Thus the storm that looked so dark rolled away without inflicting any harm on those over whom it had lowered so ominously. The finest army which united Christendom had yet raised marched against the Turks, and the emperor, says Abbe Millot, who had not yet appeared at the head of his troops, a thing surprising in an age of heroism, on this occasion took the command. He had the glory of disconcerting a formidable army, whose forces are said to have amounted to 300,000 men. Suleiman, intimidated by the display of force, withdrew his devastating hordes without coming to a battle, and the emperor, leaving Germany in order to superintend the vast military projects he was now setting on foot in other countries, The church had rest from persecution, and the period of her tranquility was prolonged for well nigh a decade and a half. Chapter 2. The German Anabaptists, or the Heavenly Kingdom. Peace in the Church. In the world, distress. Its four great rulers. Troubles of Henry VIII. Mortifications of Francis I. Labors of Charles V. Griefs of Clement VII. A contrast. The Anabaptist prophets. Matthias the baker. The new Mount Zion. Morals of the sect. Buckholt the tailor. The Heavenly Kingdom. Buckholt the king of the Heavenly Kingdom. Nominates 12 apostles. Sends out 28 evangelists. Their instructions and departure. Their pate. Marriage abolished. Munster, the den of this crew, besieged and taken. Buckholt put to death. Lesson. If the church had rest, society around it was terribly convulsed. On the earth was distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. What miserable and distracted lives were those which were led by the four great potentates that governed Europe! Cares, perplexities, and disappointments came crowding in upon them, and filled up every hour of every day with their outwardly brilliant, but inwardly most unhappy existences. Henry of England had commenced his great divorce. The delays and doublings of the Vatican kept him in a perpetual fume, and when at length his suit reached its final issue in the papal court, the haughty monarch was thrown into a paroxysm of rage, which shaped itself ultimately into a course of crime. His impetuous and choleric temper could as little brook the opposition he was meeting with from the Protestants of his own kingdom, who had thrown off popery while he had thrown off only the pope, and aimed at stepping into his vacant place in the consciences of his subjects. Francis I of France was every year becoming a guiltier and more wretched man. His rival, Charles V, had robbed him of the laurels which he had won in his earlier campaigns. To the anger and shame which his imprisonment in Madrid left rankling in his soul were added to the loss of the Italian duchies, and the recent humiliating peace of Cambrai. Francis gave himself no rest, if haply he might wipe out these disgraces and humble the haughty man who had inflicted them upon him. He intrigued to sow dissension between Clement and the emperor. He toiled to raise new armaments in the hope that past defeats would be forgotten in the splendor of new victories. But all that he reaped from these harassing labors was only to add thereby to the weight of his subjects' burden, and to the list of his own embarrassment and disappointments. The career of Charles V was outwardly more prosperous, but at the heart of his glory were labor and sorrow. Raised above all other men in point of worldly state, the emperor was in hourly terror of falling from the dazzling pinnacle on which he stood, and in order to maintain himself was compelled to have continual resort to fresh levies, new battles, and the expenditure of yet more millions of gold crowns, till at length the gulf was dug into which himself and his kingdom finally descended. Not to speak of Francis, who was a thorn in his side, nor of Clement, whose fickle alliance gave him little satisfaction, the emperor had no faith in the order of things which he had established in Italy and Germany, and labored under continual apprehensions of his system falling in pieces around him. But worst of all, he was haunted by the spectre of Lutheranism, which a true instinct told him would one day rob him of his empire, nor could he understand how it should happen that every time he raised his sword to make an end of that detested thing, the Turk unexpectedly presented himself and seemed with menacing gestures to forbid the blow. As regards the fourth great power of the age, Clement VII of Rome, these were not times when popes, any more than temporal monarchs, could sleep in peace. His ghostly empire was falling in pieces. Kings and nations were escaping from under the tiara, and neither anathemas nor concessions, and both were tried by turns, could bring them back. Germany had revolted from its obedience. Half the Swiss cantons had lifted up the heel of heretical depravity. Sweden and Denmark were going the same downward road, and England was following fast after them. There never before had been so unfortunate a pontificate, and there have been few so anxious, perplexed, and unhappy popes, though there have been many more vicious ones. Nor was Clement happier in the sovereigns that remained with him than in those that had deserted him. The most Christian king of France and his most Catholic Majesty of Spain were fully as troublesome as useful to him. Instead of the two pillars of his throne, they rather resembled two colossal swords suspended above it, which threatened ever and anon to fall and crush it. Much artifice and management did it require on the part of Clement to poise the one against the other. At no time did the views and interests of all three coincide. On one object only were they able to agree: the overthrow of Protestantism. But even here, their jealousies and rivalships prevented their acting in concert. Their conflicting passions drew them into a whirl of excitement and of war against one another, which wasted their years, burdened their treasures, and devastated their kingdoms. Compared with the spectacles we have been contemplating, how truly sublime the position of Luther and his fellow reformers! From their closets they wield a far mightier power than Charles and Francis do from their thrones. Not armies to ravage, but ideas to enlighten the earth they do send forth. By the silent but majestic power of truth they are seen dethroning errors, pulling down tyrannies, planting the seeds of piety and liberty, and nursing the infancy of arts and letters, and free states, which are destined to remain the fruit of their labors and the monument of their wisdom when the victories of Charles and of Francis have been forgotten, and the fabric of their political greatness has mouldered into dust. The Church of Germany, during these years of peace, extended on every side. All her great teachers were still spared to her. Luther, Melanchthon, and the band of eminent men around them, still unbroken, were guiding her counsels and propagating her doctrine. By her stood the League, warding off the sword of Charles, or whatever might wish to attack her. The timid found courage to avow their convictions, and ranged themselves on the Protestant side. The whole districts in northern and central Germany came over. Anhalt and Pomerania, Augsburg, Frankfurt, Hanover, and Kempten were among the new accessions. This did not escape the notice of the emperor, but, meanwhile, it was not in his power to prevent it. He dared hardly show his displeasure at it. The prosperity of these peaceful days was, alas, disturbed by a most deplorable outbreak of lawless passion and horrible fanaticism. We have already narrated the tumult and bloodshed of which the provinces of Upper Germany were the scene about a decade before, causing, by the efforts of men who had espoused principles that converted the liberty of the gospel into worse than pagan licentiousness. The seeds of these evils were still in the soil, and the days of peace brought them to the surface a second time. In 1533, two Anabaptist prophets, John Matthias, a baker of Haarlem, and John Buckholt, a tailor in Leyden, with a body of their followers, seized upon the city of Münster in Westphalia. judging it a convenient spot from which to propagate their abominable tenets. They gave out that God had commissioned them to put down all magistracy and government, and establish the kingdom of heaven, which from its center in Munster, or Mount Zion as they styled it, was to reign over all the nations of the earth. Matthias the baker was the first monarch of this new kingdom. His talent for enterprise, his acts of sanctity, and his fervent enthusiasm fitted him for this difficult but impious project. He abolished all distinctions of rank, proclaimed a community of goods, made all eat at a common table, and abrogating marriage, permitted a plurality of wives, himself setting the example, which his followers were not slow to imitate. Matthias the baker soon died, and was succeeded by John Buckholt, the tailor. It was now that the new heavenly kingdom shone forth in all its baleful splendor. Buckholt gave out that it was the will of God, made known to him by special revelation, that he should sit upon the throne of his father David, and discharge the august office of universal monarch of the world. He ordered a crown and scepter, both of the best gold, to be prepared for him, and he never appeared abroad without these insignia of his sovereignty. He dressed himself in the most sumptuous garments, had a Bible and naked sword carried before him, and coined money stamped with his own image. He fell into a sleep of 3 days, and on awakening, calling for pen and ink, he wrote down on a slip of paper the names of the 12 men of good family in Munster, whom he nominated heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. He had a high throne erected in the marketplace, covered with a cloth of gold, where, attended by his officers of state, his guards, and his wives, of whom one bore the title of queen, he heard complaints and administered justice. He had, moreover, a body of missionaries, whose office it was to proclaim the true doctrine. 28 of these men were sent forth to preach in the cities around, and to say that the kingdom of heaven had been set up at Munster, and that John of Leyden had been commissioned by God to govern all the nations of the world, and that the time was come when the meek should inherit the earth, and the wicked be rooted out of it, and that the most terrible judgments would fall on all who should refuse to enter the heavenly kingdom. One of these 28 deputies returned to Mount Zion to tell what acceptance their message had met with. Of the setting out of these missionaries, Sladen gives the following graphic description. One day, says he, Buckholt sounded a trumpet through all the streets, and commanded the citizens to meet him armed at the gate of the cathedral. When they came to the place of rendezvous, they found a supper prepared. They are ordered to sit down, being about 4,000 of them. Afterwards about 1,000 more sit down, who are on duty, while the first number were at supper. The king and the queen, with their household servants, wait at the table. After they had eaten, the supper was almost done. The king himself gives everyone a piece of bread, with these words, "Take, eat, show forth the Lord's death." The queen, in like manner, giving them a cup, bids them to show forth the Lord's death. When this was over, the prophet before mentioned gets into the pulpit, and asks them if they would obey the word of the Lord. When they all told him yes, "It is the command of the Heavenly Father," says he, "that we should send out about 28 teachers of the word, who are to go to the 4 quarters of the world and publish the doctrine which is received in this city." Then he repeats the names of his missionaries, and assigns them all their respective journeys. 6 are sent to Augsburg, 6 to Wardendorp, 8 to Soest, and as many to Coesfeld. Afterwards the king and queen and the waiters sat down to supper with those who were designed for this expedition. After supper, those 28 men we mentioned are sent away by night. To everyone, besides provisions by the way, was given a crown in gold, which they were to leave in those places that refused to believe their doctrine, as a testimony of their ruin and eternal destruction, for rejecting that peace and saving doctrine which they had been offered. These men went out accordingly, and when they had reached their respective posts, they cry out in the towns that men must repent, otherwise they would shortly be destroyed. They spread their coats upon the ground before the magistrates, and throw down their crowns before them, and protest that they were sent by the Father to offer them peace if they should receive it. They commanded them to let all their fortunes be common, but if they refused to accept it, then this gold should be left as a token of their wickedness and ingratitude. They added that these were the times foretold by all the prophets in which God would make righteousness flourish all the world over, and when their king had fully discharged his office and brought things to that perfection, so as to make righteousness prevail everywhere, then the time would come in which Christ would deliver up the kingdom to the Father. As soon as they had done their speech, says Sladen, they were apprehended and examined, first in a friendly manner, but afterwards upon the rack, concerning their faith and way of living, and how the town, Münster, was fortified. Their answer was that they were only taught the true doctrine, which they were ready to maintain with the hazard of their lives, for since the times of the apostles, the word of God was never rightly delivered, nor justice observed. That there were but 4 prophets, whereof 2 were righteous, David and John of Leyden, the other 2 wicked, vis-a-vis, the Pope and Luther, and this latter the worst. Buckhold combined the duties of missionary with those of universal sovereign. Not only did he press upon his preachers to exhort their hearers to use the liberty wherewith the gospel had invested them, more especially in the matter of marriage, he would himself at times ascend his throne in the marketplace, and turning it into a pulpit, would harangue the people on the propriety of following his example in the matter of taking to themselves more wives. This was surely an unnecessary labor, considering that the passions of the citizens were no longer restrained either by the authority of laws or by the sense of decency. In the wake of lust, as always happens, came blood. Münster, the den of this filthy crew, stank in the nostril of Papist and Protestant alike. It was a thing so supremely offensive and disgusting that it was not possible to live in the same country with it. No matter whether one believed in the Mass or in Protestantism, this heavenly kingdom was more than either religion could tolerate, and must, in the name of that common humanity of which it was the reproach, be swept away. The princes of the Rhine provinces in 1535 united their forces and marched against the city, now strongly fortified. They besieged and took it. Buckhold was led about in chains and exhibited in several German towns. He was finally brought back to Münster, the scene of his grandeur and crimes, and there subjected to an agonizing death. The body of the prophet was, after death, put into an iron cage, and the dead bodies of 2 of his followers being similarly dealt with, all 3 were hung at the top of the city tower, as a public spectacle and warning, Buckhold in the midst, and on either side a companion. Luther sought to make his countrymen understand the lesson taught them by these deplorable occurrences. The gospel, he said, was the only safe path between 2 abysses. Rome, by usurping authority over the moral law, had opened one abyss. The prophets of Münster, by abrogating that law, had opened another. The gospel, by maintaining the supremacy of that law, placed the conscience under the authority of God, its rightful ruler, and so gave man liberty without licentiousness. And if the world would avoid falling headlong into the gulf that yawned on either hand, it must go steadily forward in the road of Protestantism. Rome and Münster might seem wide apart, but there was a point where the 2 met. From the indulgence box of Tetzel came an immunity from moral obligation, quite as complete as that of the heavenly kingdom of the Anabaptist prophet of Münster. Chapter 3. Accession of Princes and States to Protestantism. Württemberg. Captivity of Duke Christopher. Escape. Philip of Hesse takes arms to restore the Duke. His success. The Duke of Württemberg joined the Protestants. Death of Duke George. Accession of Albertine Saxony to Protestantism. All central and northern Germany now Protestant. Austria and Bavaria still popish. Protestant movements in Austria. Petition of 24 Austrian nobles. Accession of the Palatinate. The Elector Archbishop of Cologne embraces Protestantism. Expelled from his principality. Barbarossa. Dissimulation of the Emperor. Purposes war. We turn to Protestantism, which, as we have said above, was continually multiplying its adherents and enlarging its area. At this hour a splendid addition was unexpectedly made to its territorial domain. In the year 1519, Duke Ulrich of Württemberg had been expelled from his dominions, having made himself odious to his subjects by his profligate manners and tyrannical dispositions. The Emperor Charles V seized on his territory, gave it to his brother Ferdinand of Austria, who occupied it with his troops, and to make all sure the emperor carried off Christopher, the son of the Duke, in his train. The young captive, however, contrived to give his Majesty the slip. The imperial cavalcade was slowly winding up the northern slopes of the Alps. It might be seen disappearing at this moment as it descended into some gorge or wound round some spur of the mountains, and coming fully into view the next as it continued its toilsome ascent toward the summit of the pass. The van of the long and brilliant procession now neared the snows of the summit, while its rear was only in mid-ascent. The young Duke, who meditated flight, watched his opportunity, fell behind. The vigilance of the guards was relaxed. A friendly rock interposed between him and the imperial cavalcade. He saw that the moment was come. He turned his horse's head, and followed by a single attendant whom he had let into the secret, fled, while the emperor continued his progress upward. When at length his flight was known, the pursuit began in hot haste. But it was all in vain. The pursuers returned without him, and it was given out that the young Duke of Württemberg, in crossing the mountains, had been slain by brigands, or had perished by accident. Years wore on. The Duke was believed to be dead. Meanwhile, the Württembergers found the yoke of Austria, under which the emperor had placed them, more unbearable than that of Ulrich, which they had cast off, and begun to sigh for their legitimate ruler. It was now the year 1532. It became known that the young Christopher was still alive, that he had been all the while in hiding with his relations on the confines of Alsace and Burgundy, and that he had embraced the Reformed faith in his retirement. As these same opinions had been spreading in Württemberg, the desire was all the stronger on the part of the inhabitants of that territory to have the son of their former sovereign, the young Duke, back as their prince. The advantage of strengthening the League of Schmalkald and enlarging the Protestant area by so splendid an addition as Württemberg was obvious to the Protestant princes. But this could not be done without war. Luther and Melanchthon recoiled from the idea of taking arms. The League was strictly defensive. Nevertheless, Philip of Hesse, one of its most active members, undertook the project on his own responsibility. He set about raising an army in order to drive out the Austrians and restore Christopher to his dukedom. Further, the Landgrave of Hesse came to a secret arrangement with the King of France, who agreed to furnish the money for the payment of the troops. It was the moment to strike. The emperor was absent in Spain. Ferdinand of Austria had the Turk on his hands. Francis I, ever ready to ride post between Rome and Wittenberg, had sent the money, and Protestant Germany had furnished the soldiers. The Landgrave began the campaign in the end of April. His first battle was fought on the 13th of May, and by the end of June he had brought the war to a successful issue. Ferdinand had to relinquish the dukedom. Ulrich and his son Christopher were restored, and with them came liberty for the new opinions. A brilliant addition had been made to the Schmalkald League, and a Protestant wedge driven into southern Germany. Nor did this close the list of Protestant successes. Among the German princes was no more restless, resolute, and consistent opponent of Lutheranism than George, Duke of Albertine, Saxony. His opposition, based on a sincere belief in the doctrines of Romanism, was inflamed by personal antipathy to Luther. He raged against the Reformer as a firebrand and revolutionist, and the Reformer, in his turn, was at no pains to conceal the contempt in which he held the Duke, whom he commonly styled the Clown. On the 24th of April, 1539, George, Duke of Saxony, died. By his death, without issue, for his two sons had predeceased him, his succession fell to his brother Henry, whose attachment to Protestantism was as zealous as had been that of his deceased brother to popery. Duke George ordered in his last will that his brother should make no change in the religion of his states, and failing fulfillment of these conditions, he bequeathed his kingdom to the emperor and Ferdinand of Austria. Henry, on the first news of his brother's death, hastened to Dresden, and disregarding the injunction in the will on the matter of religion, he took possession of the kingdom by making himself be proclaimed not only in the capital, but in Leipzig and other great towns. Luther was invited to preach a course of sermons at Leipzig, to initiate the people into the doctrines of the Reformed faith. And in the course of a few weeks, the ancient rites were changed, and the Protestant worship was set up in their room. The change was hailed with joy by the majority of the inhabitants, some of whom had already embraced the Reformed opinions, but were restrained from the avowal of them by the prisons and executioners of Duke George. The accession of this powerful dukedom to the Schmalkald League converted what had heretofore been a danger, lying as it did in the heart of the Lutheran states, into a buttress of the Protestant cause. In Brandenburg there were thousands of Protestants, but secretly for fear of the Elector Joachim. In 1539, Joachim I died. With him fell the Mass, and on its ruins rose the Protestant worship. Brunswick followed in 1542. A chain of Protestant states now extended in an almost unbroken line from the shores of the Baltic to the banks of the Rhine. The whole of central and northern Germany was now Protestant. On the side of the old faith there remained only Austria, Bavaria, and the Palatinate, and the ecclesiastical principalities of the Rhine. Nor did it seem that these states would long be able to resist the advances of Protestantism. In all of them a religious movement was already on foot, and if peace should be prolonged for a few years, they would, in all likelihood, be permanently added to the side of the Reform. On the 13th of December, 1541, a petition was presented to Ferdinand in the name of the nobility and states of Austria, praying for the free exercise of religion. The petition was signed by 24 nobles and 10 cities, among which was Vienna. The neighboring provinces of Styria and Carniola joined in a request for freedom of conscience. Referring to the miseries of their times, The wars, pestilences, and famines which these 16 years had witnessed, and the desolations which the Turk had inflicted, the petitioners pointed to the corruption of religion as the cause which had drawn this terrible chastisement upon them. In the whole body politic, say they, there is nothing pure or sound. All discipline, both public and private, is laid aside. We truly know no other medicine, most dread sovereign, than that the word of God be truly taught, and the people stirred up to amendment of life, that in confidence thereof they may withstand the violence of the Turks. For in the true worshipping of God all our safety consists. Wherefore we humbly beseech your majesty to give command that the gospel be purely taught, especially that point of doctrine which relates to justification, vis-a-vis, that our sins are pardoned through Christ alone. In the next place, that men be exhorted to the practice of charitable and good works, which are as it were the fruit and signs of faith. In like manner, that they who desire it may have the sacrament of the Lord's Supper given them according to the custom of the primitive church. That injunction be also laid upon the bishops, according to the late decree of the empire, that they reform what is amiss in the church, and that they adopt able ministers to instruct the people, and not to turn out sound preachers as they have always done hitherto. To this request, King Ferdinand would fain have said peremptorily and roundly no. But with Hungary pressing him on one side and the Turk on the other, he dared not use such plainness of speech. He touched in his reply on the efforts he had made to have the word of God rightly preached, according to the traditions of the fathers and the interpreters of the church. He spoke sanguinely of the coming council, which was to compose all differences about religion, and exhorted them meanwhile to avoid innovations and follow in the footsteps of their fathers and walk in the old way of their religion. Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.